Strap onto your horses, ladies and gentlemen, because this is gonna be a long one. In my last CD Projekt Red video, I discussed the studio's response to negative reviews posted on website Glassdoor, which is basically like a Yelp for employees. In these reviews, feedback for and against the studio were not only consistent, they also spanned a few years. Common complaints included long working hours, abnormally excessive crunch time, incompetent or inexperienced management, poor decision-making and planning, constant miscommunications, erratic CEO, low salaries, low employee retention, high employee rotation, an excessive amount of novices filling important positions, bullying and mistreatment of employees, oppressive hierarchy system, in-office politics, broken promises, and more. The general consensus seemed to be that while the studio has a lot of ambition, as well as talented and friendly people, the way it's currently run results in games taking longer to make than they should, employees having to crunch for much longer than normal, and low morale across the board. The short of it was that they make great games with great ambition at the expense of their employees' lives, health, and work environment. Now, when I first presented this information, many doubted the validity of these Glassdoor reviews, and I don't blame them. Many were quick to defend CD Projekt Red by citing how Glassdoor, much like Yelp, was a website where anyone could create an account and potentially post a review, which was a valid argument. But the reason these reviews caught my attention was because the feedback, both positive and negative, were too detailed and too consistent throughout a long period of time. Not to mention that many of them talked about things like how the studio houses a vegetarian canteen, which is information they couldn't have known unless they really worked there. So just as there was a possibility that some of these reviews were fake, I figured there was also a possibility that some of these reviews were real. I chose to see the glass half full. Confidence in my hunch only strengthened when CD Projekt Red, in a strange move, took the time to actually respond to the Glassdoor reviews, which only lent credence to the possibility that there was more significance to them than we thought. Not to mention that their statement never outright denied the validity of these reviews. On the contrary, it added more fuel to the fire through vague phrases like, "This approach to making games is not for everyone." Which brings us to this video. Ever since word of these Glassdoor reviews began spreading, I've actually been contacted by several ex-CD Projekt Red developers who corroborated many of the complaints against the studio. The information that I'm about to present to you comes from two sources, both of whom I've confirmed without a shadow of a doubt to be the real deal. Let's just call them source A and B. Now, obviously, I can't tell you who they are or provide any hints about their identity, but suffice to say that they sent ample evidence as proof. Photos, ID, resumes, files, information, name credits, the whole 9 yards. We've been in constant contact for the last month and a half, and here's what they had to say about what really goes on behind the scenes at CD Projekt Red, starting with information provided by Source A. On the topic of the Glassdoor reviews, the first clarification was that Polish people don't really use Glassdoor. They have their own review sites for that. The Glassdoor reviews were most likely written by Westerners, especially since the frequency of reviews in certain time periods coincides with the number of Westerners who were employed at the studio in the same time frame. According to Source A, back in 2012, CD Projekt Red was comprised of 99% Polish people with very few Westerners, which coincides with how only one Glassdoor review was posted at the time. But now, over 40% of the studio is comprised of Westerners, which coincides with how reviews began to be posted more frequently from 2015 and beyond. It would seem as though the influx of Westerners at the studio over the past 2 to 3 years also resulted in an influx of Glassdoor reviews within that same time period. Source A also confirmed that there is indeed a vegetarian canteen at the studio, as many of the Glassdoor reviews pointed out, further corroborating their validity. Again, this is stuff they couldn't have known unless they actually worked there. The canteen was apparently built in 2012, if you care to know. know. Now, one of the most common complaints in the Glassdoor reviews was low salaries, and on that topic, source A said that in Poland, CD Projekt Red is actually the best paying game development studio in the country. However, while salary is adequate for Poland's living standards, it's actually still low compared to what most studios from Western countries offer, making it more likely that the Glassdoor reviews complaining about salaries were written by Western employees. As for how salaries are distributed at CD Projekt Red, it can be broken down by department rank as follows. Juniors usually get around $1,000 a month, specialists get $2,000 a month, seniors get $3,000 a month, and leads get $4,000 to $6,000 a month, although these figures could fluctuate depending on the individual's skill, experience, and negotiation. This is enough to live comfortably in Poland, as a one-room apartment in Warsaw costs as little as $350, and a two-room apartment as little as $500 to $550. But again, still much lower compared to what other studios offer, which is why many aspiring game developers in Poland move out of the country to pursue jobs in studios that pay 2 to 4 times more for the same work. However, there are those who stay not for the money, but for the passion of making games. It was with this passion that Source A joined CD Projekt Red, but to their dismay, they weren't greeted with a great first impression. One of their earliest memories was being handed an exorbitant amount of work that was intended for far more people than the studio had, with schedules that would inevitably extend beyond their deadlines. Granted, at this point in time, Polish game developers were somewhat new to this high level of game development, which meant that they all had to learn as they went, leading to many mistakes, many lessons learned, as well as widespread burnout that led many to leave the studio. To convey just how many people left, I will send photos of the CD Projekt Red team, one from the Witcher 1 days and another from Witcher 2, marked to show who left and who remained. There might be a few members missing in these photos because some were sick while others were on vacation, but most of them are there. In the Witcher 1 team photo, I counted 62 people, and among them, 38 were marked to have left between the time the game launched and in the years that followed. That's around 61% of the staff from Witcher 1 who decided to leave eventually. In the Witcher 2 team photo, I counted 96 people, and among them, 40 of them were marked to have left after the game launched and in the years that followed. That's around 40% of the staff who up and left. And while I wasn't sent an annotated photo of Witcher 3's team, I was told that after the game's launch, a significant portion of the studio's workforce quit once more. While it isn't abnormal for a few staff members to shift around after a project's completion or during a transitional period, frequent mass employee rotations like these were definitely unprecedented. It was also pointed out to me that due to the studio's lack of proper documentation, when people left the company, they often took all their knowledge with them rather than pass it on to the next of kin, resulting in a lot of time being wasted catching people up, or a lot of valuable knowledge getting lost in transition, forcing them to redo a lot of the groundwork for their next project from scratch. As for what exactly drove so many people away from CD Projekt Red after the release of each game, there were a number of reasons, starting with higher-ups who had a tendency to make big plans for way more manpower than they possessed and without having designs for systems and mechanics, resulting in the scale and direction of the project changing frequently, drastically, and spontaneously late in the development process, costing time, work, and resources. Below that, the studio has also had a lot of problems with inexperienced and overly ambitious staff members with a tendency to underestimate how much time it takes to complete certain tasks, causing major scheduling issues later on. It's a side effect of the studio's lax attitude towards documentation, which while grants the staff a lot of freedom to work on their own terms, that freedom often backfires as it detracts from considerations for things like milestones, deadlines, and realistic goals, which are all very important. Further disrupting their game's development process is the studio's tendency to spend huge chunks of time building demos for marketing purposes. Because they're often so behind schedule, instead of being able to show off real gameplay, they have to set time aside to build pre-rendered scenes made to look like gameplay, or heavily scripted gameplay presentations that implement hacks, and workarounds to make certain unfinished gameplay mechanics work specifically for that demo, and after the demo is presented, they have to go back and actually make these mechanics work for the full final game. It's mismanagement from top to bottom, I'm told, and in the end, everyone pays the price. Release dates are pushed back time and again, a lot of time, money, and resources are wasted, and employees are forced to crunch for long stretches of time as a result. It's this intense and chaotic process that many just don't want to go through again, so they leave. Perhaps this is what CD Projekt Red was referring to when they said, "This approach to making games is not for everyone." Now, this kind of stuff can happen in any studio, but where it becomes a problem for CD Projekt Red is that they've apparently made a habit out of their chaotic process. Even after Witcher 1, the studio didn't strive to optimize or improve their game development approach after each game release. They used the same disorganized methods while their games only grew larger in scope and ambition. Witcher 2, for example, began development in 2008 and was intended for 150 people to work on throughout the course of 2 years, but the project actually only started with 60 people. As development proceeded, the team eventually grew to 80 people, but around 30% of the game's original concepts, ideas, and plans were cut along the way, which was again just a lot of wasted time and resources. Then, in 2010, after 2 years of development, the team grew to 100 people, but Witcher 2, which should have been completed by then, was still nowhere near alpha. As Witcher 2's development approached its original Q3 2010 release window, the project failed every single one of its development milestones, and 20 to 30% of the game remained undelivered, a result of frequent last-minute changes late in the process. This forced CD Projekt Red to delay the game to Q2 2011, an additional half a year of arduous crunch time for the team. Witcher 1 also experienced numerous delays throughout development, with the game having launched over a year later than originally intended, and even then, I was told that the code was a tangled mess. Now, at least with Witcher 1, that was the studio's first foray into high-level game development, so this was all somewhat understandable back then. But nothing was learned or adjusted from that experience. The studio, having only known this sporadic way of making games and having found success in it, resorted to the same methods and approach for subsequent sequels, resulting in chaotic development environments. Old habits die hard, as they say. Same thing happened with Witcher 3's development, a game that, you may recall, was delayed twice prior to launch. It was first delayed from fall 2014 to February 2015, and then a second time from February 2015 to May 2015, despite the studio having promised it wouldn't be delayed again. Contributing to the delay was how over a year of the game's development was wasted on trying to implement a system that would allow players to aim and cut weak points during combat in a similar fashion to Fallout's VATS system, all of which was unfortunately cut in the end. So yeah, the point is that CD Projekt Red doesn't always manage, schedule, or plan their projects out in the most efficient manner, even if their final products do eventually turn out to be great. To further highlight this vicious cycle of the studio chewing on more than they can swallow, Source A provided a timeline of pivotal events that transpired throughout the studio's history, which not only reveals valuable insight on how CD Projekt Red operated all these years, but also details a similarly disorganized development process ensuing for the highly anticipated Cyberpunk 2077. The year that kickstarted the studio into notoriety was 2008. After a long and arduous learn-as-you-go development process, Witcher 1 launched to great success, and they quickly began development on Witcher 2 using the Aurora game engine. They also began creating the Red engine for Witcher 3 at the same time, which started out with a team of a couple coders, designers, and artists. Other projects in the pipeline included a Witcher 1 port for Xbox, developed in partnership with Widescreen Games called Rise of the White Wolf, as well as a first-person shooter called They that was being developed by Metropolis Software, a studio that CD Projekt had bought. As far as the Xbox port of Witcher 1 is concerned, the process was apparently a complete mess. Widescreen Games was aiming to make a one-to-one port, but CD Projekt Red wanted them to update the game with an upgraded combat system, UI, controls, character models, and more. But Widescreen Games wasn't equipped with the budget, resources, or expertise to pull this off, and throughout the whole process, CD Projekt Red was never happy with the results. It was a clash between Widescreen's inexperience with console production and CD Projekt Red's wide-reaching ambition. By 2009, the studio canceled both The Witcher: Rise of the White Wolf for Xbox and They. Financial troubles that year also left CD Projekt Red no choice but to fire about 40% of its staff and cut salaries by 25%, all while Witcher 2's development was ongoing. During these dark and turbulent times, CEO Marcin Iwinski also decided to move Witcher 2's development from the Aurora engine, which was described to be garbage, to the Red engine that was originally intended for Witcher 3. A big part of this decision came from the studio wanting to port Witcher 2 to consoles, a task that the Aurora engine couldn't handle. But because the Red engine was still early in development, it lacked many fundamental tools and was hardly prepared for making games. Cyberpunk 2077 is apparently facing a similar issue, but more on that later. Despite setbacks, they did manage to scramble together a demo in time for E3 2010, but as you can see from the footage, the game looked pretty rough at the time. After working on the game for another year, the studio eventually managed to complete and release Witcher 2 on May 17, 2011, following 2.5 years of arduous, chaotic development. What many may not know was that the game was completed on the 11th hour, which was why during the game's release party, half the team sat in the studio working on fixing crashes and bugs that the game had shipped with. It's also worth noting that the original plan had been to release both PC and Xbox versions of the game simultaneously, but that plan was quickly thrown out the window when they realized that they would barely manage to get the PC version out on time. Regardless, the game did finally launch, and it was make or break for the studio. They were essentially hanging by a thread, and failure would lead to a major financial crisis. Fortunately, Witcher 2 sold very well, especially after the game finally made its way to Xbox 360 a year later on April 17, 2012, in the form of Witcher 2 Enhanced Edition. It was pointed out to me that the extra bells and whistles of Enhanced Edition weren't really new, but rather things that were cut from the rushed original release and finally added. So in reality, it's less of an enhanced edition and more of a complete edition, although from a marketing standpoint, the former title was a no-brainer. Overall, the game was a great success though, and having generated a sizable amount of profit from Witcher 2, allowing the studio to get out of their financial hole, CD Projekt Red once again began thinking big. That same year, 2012, they not only began production on Witcher 3, but also acquired a new IP, Cyberpunk. It was also around that time, following the excessive crunch that the team endured during Witcher 2's development, that a significant portion of the staff left the studio, leading CD Projekt Red to begin hiring from outside of Poland. They managed to draw a lot of attention by announcing their acquisition of the Cyberpunk IP on May 31st, 2012 during the CD Projekt Red Summer Conference event, after which they unveiled the game's full title, Cyberpunk 2077, in a separate conference hosted on October 28th, 2012. From there, throughout 2012, the studio hired and assigned around 20 to 30 people to make prototypes for the game, but progress was slow and most of the work consisted of documentations, concepts, and simple demos for things like the dialogue system and walking around in the city. To further increase hype for this new venture, CD Projekt Red outsourced a CGI trailer to a company called Playtage Image, who also did much of the CGI cutscenes for Witcher 1, 2, and 3. When Cyberpunk 2077's first teaser trailer was finally shown to the public on January 2013, the studio garnered a lot of interest from many game developers outside Poland who were excited for a chance to join the studio and be involved with this ambitious project. 2013 was also the year when Witcher 3's development kicked into full gear, but the team was already beginning to feel an all too familiar, overwhelming pressure. Witcher 2's development was harrowing enough with its months-long crunch for what was ultimately a rushed product. But with Witcher 3, the team was presented with exponentially more ambitious plans, like an open world that was 4 times the size of the prequel, a number of quests to match it, a brand new combat system, and new mechanics like horse riding and boat sailing, among other things. So grand was the scale of this project that when CD Projekt Red hired people to work on Cyberpunk, these new hires were quote-unquote temporarily moved to help out with Witcher 3. Eventually, throughout the year, almost everyone was moved away from Cyberpunk to help finish the massive game. An unfortunate side effect was that there were many cases of people who joined the studio just to work on Cyberpunk, but after being moved to work on Witcher 3 for 3 years, they left without ever making anything for what they had originally signed up for. 2013 was also a big year of expansion for CD Projekt Red. They opened a second studio in Krakow, Poland, and by year's end, despite the significant number of staff that left, their hiring spree allowed them to grow the team to around 200 people. The following year, 2014, much to the team's dismay, Witcher 3 unsurprisingly missed its original release date, and unbeknownst to the public, the game was actually nowhere near alpha at the time. At around the same time, studio head Adam Badowski suffered the tragic loss of his girlfriend, who fought and succumbed to cancer. Her name was Karolina Grachowska, and sources pointed out to me that she was lovingly memorialized in Witcher 3's end credits. Throughout her days of sickness, Adam was often absent from the studio, but after her passing, he returned in full force and demanded changes to many aspects of the game that were already well on their way or already finished, causing further setbacks. By now, Cyberpunk 2077 was pretty much completely shelved away for the time being, with only a handful of concept artists and story writers being assigned to work on it, while the rest of the studio dedicated all their time, effort, and resources to completing Witcher 3. After the game's second delay, and after what was essentially a year and a half of constant chaotic crunch, Witcher 3 was finally completed, and the game launched on May 19th, 2015, to both critical and commercial success. This marked the first time that the studio managed to launch a game for all major platforms simultaneously, PC, PS4, and Xbox One, which significantly contributed to the game's financial success. Big bonuses were handed out that year, and overall, Witcher 3's launch was a big cause for celebration. Piggybacking off of that success, throughout Q3 of 2015, Heart of Stone and Blood and Wine, which were originally intended to be small add-ons, evolved into major expansions. Pretty much anyone who was free was assigned to these two projects, culminating into an additional full year of work. While all this was happening, CD Projekt Red also began developing the standalone Gwent game, which began with a small team of 20 that quickly grew to 70-80 people. Furthermore, Cyberpunk was finally dusted off to begin development anew. Just to be clear, it was late 2015, 3 years since Cyberpunk 2077's announcement, and the project was still in its conceptual stages. While the core team worked on Witcher 3's 2 expansions, Cyberpunk was assigned a smaller team to create real gameplay prototypes for a long laundry list of conceptual features like a multiplayer component that allowed a team of 4 cyberpunks to get in a car and seamlessly join game instances, multiplayer being a first for the studio, a wide variety of classes and extensive character customization, classes also being a first for the studio, a massive city with even bigger crowds than Witcher 3, all manners of vehicles ranging from boats, planes, to cars a la GTA 5, a vast variety of customizable melee and ranged weapons and gadgets, hidden weapons, exoskeletons, and clothes, the inclusion of both first-person and third-person camera perspectives, stories for both male and female protagonists with cutscenes dialogue system, and Cyberpunk's trademark cyberspace, or the Matrix as it's formerly known, for both story and minigames. Throughout 2015 and 2016, this separate team managed to work on basic elements, make simple mechanics, and set some foundations for the game to be built upon. On May 31st, 2016, Witcher 3's last DLC, Blood and Wine, finally launched and was met with critical and commercial success. As development on Witcher 3 finally winded down with the completion of the title's last piece of content, the core team finally shifted their focus to Cyberpunk 2077 and began making plans for the massive project. But the scale of Witcher 3's success set the bar so high for Cyberpunk that no one can reach it and ambitions were out of human scale, Source A described, citing how they planned to hire over 200 additional people to work on this project. Story drafts and gameplay prototypes were rejected many times with little to no direction on how to reach what seemed like unattainable goals. The studio also learned that year that Red Engine 3 wasn't adequate to fully realize Cyberpunk 2077's ambitious ideas. For example, multiplayer couldn't work with the game's various complicated systems in this engine, as there was too much data to synchronize and transfer. Red Engine 3 also couldn't handle making the type of expansive game world that Cyberpunk 2077 demanded, as it wasn't made to fully realize tall buildings and skyscrapers and expansive vertical spaces. Furthermore, the engine had no support for implementing shooting mechanics, vehicles, any of the concepts and ideas for cyberspace, and basically a lot of the basic stuff that they would need to create this game. Thus, the core CD Projekt Red team had no choice but to start rewriting and updating the Red Engine, mostly from scratch, which Source A described as a couple years worth of work. I would like to point out that at this point, it's late 2016, 4 years after Cyberpunk 2077's announcement, and the studio just realized they needed a brand new engine to start making the game. All of this actually coincides with news reports from 2016 suggesting that CD Projekt Red was in the middle of overhauling their dev tools, and as one CD Projekt Red dev said, upgrading their software quite drastically. Most of the team could do nothing but wait and do some conceptual art and design work, while the coders worked overtime to build the new engine. I was also told that throughout this time there was a constant war between studio head Adam Badowski and the design, tech, and art departments about the game's features and its overall vision. So despite their recent successes, 2016 was an all-around tense and tumultuous year for the studio. Eventually, with Cyberpunk 2077 coming to a standstill as everyone waited for a new engine to be built, the team that worked on early prototypes between 2015 and 2016 was disbanded, and the prototypes themselves were discarded along with it. Interesting to note is that, once again, all of this information, the main team taking over the project after Blood and Wine's completion, the disbanding of the prototype team, and the discarding of all these early prototypes, actually coincides with Cyberpunk 2077's game director changing after Blood and Wine launched, as well as with rumors that pre-production of the game from before 2016 was completely binned. Turns out there might have been some validity to this NeoGAF post posted a few months ago on April 2017. To finish off the rest of 2016, the studio hosted big meetings to show what's next on the game's agenda, with their schedule at the time showing that they wanted a demo of Cyberpunk 2077 by E3 2017, an alpha for the game by 2018, and a completed game release by 2019. It was what Source A described to be the most bullshit presentation they had ever seen, especially considering the state that the project was in. Obviously, the game didn't have a demo for E3 2017, suggesting that there were further delays. In addition to the impossible schedule, the presentation also showed a drastically different vision for the game than what was originally advertised. The game was first planned to feature a fully customizable protagonist, a wide variety of classes, and an open world with multiplayer. That was then scaled down to one class for a male or female character, with optional multiplayer that unlocks after beating the main game. But then in this presentation, the game was scaled down even further to feature a set hero like Geralt of Rivia, with a heavy emphasis on story and cutscenes, similarly to the Witcher series but with guns and set in the future. This latest iteration of the game's vision had not been relayed to the team prior to this presentation, resulting in a lot of time being lost making unnecessary changes to the engine. It is important to note, however, that it's been some time since this presentation. With the studio's propensity to change ideas, ambition, and direction on a whim, it's actually hard to say what the game looks like right now. We'll have to wait until the game is revealed, probably, to find out for certain if the game will or won't end up featuring custom protagonists, multiple classes, and multiplayer. So by now, it's late 2016, the core team behind Witcher 3 and its expansions migrated to Cyberpunk 2077, and in case you weren't keeping count, this marked the third time that the game began development anew since its 2012 announcement. The engine wasn't ready, the studio still had no clear vision for the game, the studio heads demanded all kinds of features with no clear direction on how to implement them, and the project was nowhere near in full-scale production. It didn't help that around this time, more people left the company. What stuck out about these latest departures was that a lot of them were department leads, namely the lead engine programmer, lead AI programmer, lead physics programmer, lead graphics programmer, lead combat designer, and many more. These were people who worked at the studio for years, the ones who essentially built the Red engine for Witcher 2 and 3, and the ones whose backs CD Projekt Red built their success on, according to Source A. It's never a good sign when a bunch of key staff members leave a company en masse. And to make a long story short, with so many setbacks throughout 2016, Cyberpunk 2077 could still be ways off. The way Source A put it was that in 2012, a 2020 release window or an 8-year development cycle sounded like a joke. By 2015, a 2020 release window seemed realistic, but by now, 2017, in its current state, a 2020 release window for the game is cutting it close and will require a lot of crunch from the team. The main culprit of CD Projekt Red's mismanagement, Source A proclaimed, is Adam Badowski, head of art in Witcher 1, head of development in Witcher 2, and head of studio in Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077. Adam was described as someone with a good sense of art, not a bad person, a lot of ambition, but also someone who knows nothing about code and little about design, often providing feedback by playtesting something and then telling the team how he feels on a whim, with little clear direction. He was also described to be overworked and in a stressful position as the middleman between the CEO and the rest of the team, especially with all the in-office politics. He's also always busy and focused on a million things, to the point where even a department lead would be happy to just get a few minutes of his time to talk with him throughout a game's development process. Furthermore, he apparently micromanages everything, doesn't trust people to do their own work, constantly looking over their shoulders, and isn't very good at delegating. To prove this point, it was pointed out to me how neither Witcher 2 or Witcher 3 had an art lead. If you go through the credits, they list a lead for just about everything but art. This was apparently because Adam doesn't want to leave his old position to anyone else, so he leads both the entire team as studio head and the art department as self-proclaimed art lead. The studio did try to hire some art leads a couple times, but most of them were rejected, and the ones who did manage to get the position were often overwritten by Adam anyway, prompting them to leave after a short time. Speaking of leads, another major criticism was that the studio was comprised of too many department leads. For example, instead of having one art lead, the position is broken down to animation lead, character lead, cutscene lead, and environment lead, with self-proclaimed art lead Adam Badowski often overruling many of their decisions. Instead of having one design lead, they have a story lead, quest lead, gameplay lead, and open world lead. Instead of having a programmer lead, they have an engine lead, gameplay code lead, and animation programmer lead, so on and so forth. I was told that all of these small leads were in constant war and conflict with each other about things like game features, solutions to certain problems, and settlements between departments, in large part because their leader, Adam Badowski, held all the power and made all decisions on a whim. As a result, for the leads, making decisions became less about conversations, constructive feedback, and compromises, and more about winning Adam's favor to gain his influence. It became less about communal creation and more about kissing the king's ring and competition for the king's attention. This is where much of the in-office politics festered from, with staff members constantly scheming to one-up each other to rise through the ranks and become a part of the inner circle. It didn't help that having as many as 20 to 25 leads and producers in one room during meetings seldom yielded anything constructive, as opinions constantly clashed. When the studio did hire experienced people who approached higher-ups with valuable advice for realistic and more efficient plans to reduce wasted time, squandered resources, and excessive crunch, they were viewed as lazy and were ultimately ignored and shunned by Adam and his loyal minions, prompting them to leave after completing just one project. In an attempt to mitigate CD Projekt Red's erratic work environment, the studio resorted to hiring a bunch of producers at one point. The ones who didn't conform to the studio's ironclad ways were quickly cast out. Those who remained didn't end up contributing much anyway, and because they employed 20 to 30 producers at a time, the hiring spree only led to more dispersal of power and chaos. CD Projekt Red will never change as long as Adam Badowski is boss there, Source A declared. Having never worked at other companies, having known no other way of making games, and having experienced critical and commercial successes with Witcher 1, 2, and 3, Adam is said to believe that their approach to game development is the right one. He doesn't believe in different methods, he won't change, and in turn, neither will the way the studio operates, Source A said. Furthermore, for many of the Polish staff members, CD Projekt Red was their first game development job, so they too lack the perspective to understand and learn from the studio's mistakes. It also doesn't help that few will actually stand up to confront Adam Badowski, as most are eager to rise in rank and afraid to lose their influence and position, so instead they become yes-men. Those who do confront Adam with criticism are essentially treated like outcasts, prompting them to leave after a short while or being sent to another lesser department or position, and on occasions, they are even fired outright. So ultimately, much of CD Projekt Red's woes were primarily blamed on Adam Badowski's leadership approach, one that's supplemented by the leads, producers, and higher-ups, unwilling and being unable to provide constructive feedback. Now, much of this may be news to consumers, but behind the scenes, CD Projekt Red has apparently always had this questionable reputation as employers for years now, especially in Poland. According to Source A, most Polish people will steer clear of applying for jobs there nowadays, which is why the studio has resorted to hiring so many outsiders. It's why the percentage of Westerners working at the studio fluctuated from 1% in 2012 to over 40% in 2017. But even foreigners are beginning to catch on. The studio is now hiring more than ever, but they are also having a harder time than ever finding experienced developers from even outside the country willing to work there, which is why they have been advertising job listings on their official website and throughout social media so frequently as of late. Source A believes that at this rate, if CD Projekt Red doesn't change their ways, in the long term, they'll end up repelling talent faster than they can attract until no talent is left. But one department that they couldn't complement enough was marketing, which is comprised of about 20 people who are all very good writers and community managers. They know how to keep the community and their consumers happy, which is why discussion about the studio's mismanagement never really came to light all these years. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is everything that Source A had to say about their experience with CD Projekt Red. Pretty insightful stuff. I'd like to now move on to information shared by Source B, who provided a much briefer synopsis, albeit one that echoed very similar sentiments to those expressed by Source A. They began by stating that many of the positives and negatives listed in CD Projekt Red's Glassdoor reviews are real, with the only fake reviews being the ones that appeared after I posted my first video highlighting the issue. I was told that the root of the problem can be traced to how, because CD Projekt Red began by figuring out how to make games the hard way and found success in their methods through the Witcher series, they have known no other way of making games, with their approach being described as a combination of pathology and extreme crunch. But in Source B's experience, the crunch wasn't the worst part of working there. The biggest problem was the mentality of 5 guys getting ideas, 500 people implementing them, which not only culminated in a lack of vision and direction, but also paved the way to some bad corporate practices, like the formation of certain elite cliques within the studio comprised of founders, longtime members, and their minions, who often got away with harassing or bullying other employees. You may recall that this was something Source A also touched upon with Adam Badowski and his minions of leads, producers, and followers with ambition to rise higher through the ranks by kissing his ring constantly. Which is why Source B felt as though they wasted time working at CD Projekt Red. They regretted working there. They said that they learned about many bad practices that they couldn't imagine. They've also been in contact with many other ex-CD Projekt Red devs who experienced similar unpleasantries at the studio from these elite cliques. Fortunately for Source B, they are now working at another studio where they are much happier with their work condition. To close things off, Source B shared a few more tidbits of information that coincided with Source A's experiences at the studio. They talked about how amazing CD Projekt Red's PR is. They discussed about how there was a time during Witcher 2's development when staff was getting very low salaries with pay cuts of around $700 a month, which goes in line with Source A's information about how 40% of staff was fired and salaries were cut by 25% during Witcher 2's development due to financial troubles in 2009. And they conveyed how those who didn't conform to the studio's ironclad ways were quickly ousted, citing one incident in which a staff member left the company after being told, quote, "You listen to me or get the fuck out." With all said and done, suffice to say that the accounts from both sources A and B about their time with CD Projekt Red are quite similar and complementary to each other and to the Glassdoor reviews, which was where this whole discussion began. As I sifted through all this information, I kept coming back to a quote that I saw in a comment in website Polygon from this user claiming to be an ex-CD Projekt Red developer. The quote read, "You can give 50 guys spoons and they'll dig you a hole, but you can also give 20 guys a shovel and they could dig that same hole faster and at less personal expense. CD Projekt has immense talent when it comes to art, programming, audio, design, story, etc., but they lack well-deserved leadership, management, project time team management, and a proactive HR department that's looking to make their workers' lives better." This right here very neatly sums up the pattern of consistent feedback against the studio, whether it's in the form of Glassdoor reviews or in the form of ex-CD Projekt Red employees who felt so strongly about the issue that they felt the need to reach out to me to express their grievances. I know some will be quick to defend the studio, and I get that. After all, CD Projekt Red are in many ways heroes to the video game consumers. They ultimately release great games. They have been very fair with their DLC practices and pricing models, and they have yet to succumb to shady AAA bullshit like microtransactions and loot boxes, for which they should rightfully be commended for. It's clear that the talent, the ambition, the potential, and the good intentions are all there, but even our heroes need to be held accountable. As much as I'd like to believe that it's all sunshine and rainbows at the studio, multiple claims from various sources suggest that this isn't the case. Don't you want CD Projekt Red to be able to release high-caliber games like Witcher 3 or exciting new titles like Cyberpunk 2077 with more frequency, more efficiency, more finesse, and in a more timely manner? Don't you want the studio to be a talent magnet with a great work environment, rather than a talent repellent with a miserable one? Don't you want these developers who work so hard to make these incredible worlds we know and love to be treated and compensated fairly and humanely? I certainly do, which is why I've gone out of my way to make this video and give these ex-CD Projekt Red developers a voice. We have heard time and again from the studio's PR, their upper management, from founder Marcin Iwinski and studio head Adam Badowski, but what about the foot soldiers who are doing so much of the work and experiencing the studio's miserable mismanagement firsthand? Don't they deserve to share their side of the story too? I think so, which is why I won't bury my head in the sand and pretend like CD Projekt Red can do no wrong. This isn't about trying to make CD Projekt Red to be the bad guys or anything like that. No studio is perfect, and that's fine. It's about pointing out the issues and encouraging them to be flexible and to make changes for the benefit of the employees, the consumers, the studio, and the gaming industry as a whole. To that end, I hope the information conveyed in this video will get people talking and encourage CD Projekt Red to take a long, hard look at themselves and to take the necessary steps towards a positive change as both game makers and as employers. With that, I would like to end this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for sticking around all the way through, and if you appreciate the effort that I've put into this video, lots of hours, consider supporting me on Patreon. All contributions will go towards helping us remain 100% independent. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.